Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a question that, well, on the surface, it seems about as simple as it gets.
Uh-huh.
But as we started exploring the material one of you shared with us specifically, documentation from Matt Walsh's investigation into this very topic, we found getting a clear answer was surprisingly difficult.
Yeah. The core question being, what is a woman?
Exactly.
And this deep dive, it's based on some pretty extensive reporting, right? Following one person's journey to find an answer.
Yeah, talking to all sorts of people, experts, academics, just everyday folks, different fields, even like different continents.
Right.
And what immediately jumps out from this material, and it's presented as, frankly, a surprising finding, is just how hard it was for the author to get a straightforward, simple definition of woman from many people who you'd consider experts, or leading figures in modern gender theory.
It wasn't the sort of basic biological answer maybe you'd expect first off.
Not at all.
Yeah, that really sets the scene, doesn't it, for understanding the really varied, often contradictory responses that were encountered.
And it shines a light on the historical context, the social context that, according to this material anyway, has led us to a point where this fundamental question just sparks so much debate.
Definitely.
So let's jump right in. That initial search for a definition. What kind of answers did the author actually get early on?
Well, the material describes asking people and getting responses like someone that likes to be pretty and think of themselves as a delicate creature. That was one.
Okay.
Or, much more often, something like someone who identifies as a woman.
Right. And it's really striking, looking at the accounts presented, how often those early answers just didn't include biology or DNA.
Or reproduction.
Exactly. And some people interviewed, the report says, actually pushed back pretty hard on the idea that your birth sex has any real claim over your identity, right? So what the author apparently found was it felt like there were a million answers.
A million answers. Yeah, and observed that many folks he spoke with seemed to be relativists on this topic, defining things subjectively, based on feeling or identity.
Okay, so subjective, unless...
Well, except the material notes, when their own opinions were questioned or contradicted, then maybe not so relativist.
Interesting. So, okay, simple definitions weren't forthcoming from many contemporary sources. So the material suggests the author then dug into the history, right, to see how we got here.
Yeah, and the argument presented is that modern gender theory is actually a pretty recent thing, a Western development, largely.
Okay, so who are the key figures mentioned in that historical tracing?
This is where we first encounter someone like Magnus Hirschfeld. He's described in the material as the Einstein of sex.
Wow, okay.
And considered by the author the primogenitor of the gay rights movement, early 20th century.
What did he do?
He founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, proposed that same-sex attraction was natural, groundbreaking stuff for the time, challenging norms around sex and sexuality as presented here.
Right, challenging norms. And then, jumping forward a bit, Alfred Kinsey comes into the picture, mid-20th century.
Yep, Kinsey's research. It further questions sexual norms. His work, pretty controversial back then, suggested children were sexual beings.
And the material links that idea to later sex ed efforts.
It does. And it also mentions alleged connections between Kinsey and people in the sex industry, like Hugh Hefner, who apparently funded SESIS.
SCS, that's the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the U.S.
That's the one. So you see this thread, according to the sources, of constantly questioning traditional boundaries around sex.
Which seems to have paved the way for new ideas about gender itself.
Exactly. And building on that, the report really highlights John Money from Johns Hopkins, often called the father of gender theory.
Okay, John Money. Let's unpack his ideas as they're presented here. What was his core theory?
Well, his early theory, based on studies of intersex individuals, argued that gender was determined entirely by nurture. How a child was raised, that was it.
So nurture over nature initially.
Completely. He did later expand it to include prenatal hormones, but the main focus, it seems, stayed on behavior and upbringing over biology.
And the report makes a point of saying he was a psychologist, not an MD.
Right. A crucial distinction noted in the material. And his theories led to some deeply controversial methods.
Controversial how?
Well, the material actually asserts his support for pedophilia, framing it as part of promoting what he called unrestricted desire, which is Yeah, a very disturbing claim raised in the investigation.
That is disturbing. And isn't he linked to that famous tragic case, David Reimer?
Yes, absolutely. Born Bruce Reimer. After a circumcision accident, money guided this experiment where Bruce was raised as a girl named Brenda.
And the material stresses the parents weren't fully informed, like didn't give truly informed consent.
That's the claim. Lack of full informed consent. And the outcome, it was just devastating.
He never felt female.
Never felt like the gender he was assigned, eventually transitioned back to living as male, struggled terribly his whole life, and ultimately, tragically, took his own life.
Just awful.
The report argues money essentially sold them the perfect lie, this idea that biology was irrelevant. And it suggests the media kind of ran with money's ideas, helping normalize them and facilitating the rise of sex change operations.
So, following that path, we get to Judith Butler.
Judith Butler, UC Berkeley. Her book, Gender Trouble, from 1990 is highlighted as being hugely influential.
And her argument, as explained here, is that gender is performative. What does that mean exactly?
Performative, yeah. Meaning it's not something innate inside you, and it's not just something you learn once when you're young. Okay. Instead, it's the result of your ongoing actions, your behavior, how you present yourself to the world. It's something you do.
Like a performance.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
The report also mentions her writing style is seen as very complex, maybe deliberately unclear, which could serve to deter critics.
Okay, so that gives us some historical context, according to the sources. How does the material then show these ideas playing out today in therapy, medicine, society?
Right. Well, the report looks at therapy first. It references conversations with therapists like Gert Comfrey.
And what's her approach as described?
She practices what's called gender affirmation therapy. The description focuses on validating the individual's self-definition, lots of listening, exploring feelings.
Affirmation, okay.
Yeah, and viewing gender as this ongoing developmental process, something that's never really finished. And it's performative again, that where it's about how you want to show up in the world.
And then the medical side, transitioning.
The report covers that too, citing conversations with people like Dr. Marcy Bowers, who's a well-known sex change surgeon, and Dr. Forcier, a doctor working with LGBTQ plus youth.
What do they say about the procedures?
Dr. Bowers is quoted describing surgical procedures as a permanent, irreversible change. The report also gets into costs, mentions of vaginoplasty potentially costing around $30,000 out of pocket.
Wow. But insurance coverage has increased.
Significantly, according to the material. And it links this increase to changes like the DSM updating its terminology.
The DSM, that's the diagnostic manual.
Right, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Changing gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. That shift, the report suggests, opened the door for changes in Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance policies.
And this has led to what? A bigger industry?
Yeah, contributing to what the report frames as the gender transition industry becoming a multi-billion-dollar enterprise.
Okay, now a really big part of this whole discussion, especially for minors, is puberty blockers and hormones.
Right.
What does the material say there?
Well, it presents Dr. Forcier asserting that puberty blockers are reversible.
Reversible, okay.
And that these treatments are evidence-based, backed by scientific consensus. That's the position presented.
I sense a but coming.
But yeah, the report then sharply contrasts that view. It presents data and studies suggesting potential long-term side effects from blockers, links to health problems in FDA reports.
And what about outcomes? Does it mention what happens after blockers?
It cites studies indicating that nearly 100% of children who start on puberty blockers then go on to take cross-sex hormones or have surgery.
Nearly 100%. Wow. Okay, this connects then to that argument you sometimes hear directed at parents, right? The suicide threat framing.
Exactly. The living daughter or dead son dilemma. It's presented as a common argument used to push for immediate affirmation and medical intervention.
But the report includes counter-arguments.
Oh, definitely. Powerful ones from experts like Dr. Miriam Grossman, a child psychiatrist, and Dr. Jordan Peterson, the clinical psychologist.
What's their perspective, according to the material?
Their view, as presented, is that many kids experiencing gender dysphoria actually have significant pre-existing conditions.
Like what?
Things like anxiety, depression, maybe autism spectrum traits, past trauma, experiences with bullying, issues they argue are being overlooked.
And the gender identity aspect becomes an explanation.
Yeah, they suggest gender ideology can offer these distressed kids a sort of ready-made explanation for their suffering, and importantly, a peer group, a sense of belonging.
And Dr. Peterson, the material says, argues against affirmation as therapy.
Very strongly. He's quoted saying, "True therapy shouldn't be affirmation, but helping people explore the roots of their confusion and suffering." He actually calls the term gender-affirming therapist a contradiction.
That's a strong statement.
It is. And the report also critiques studies that proponents of affirmation often cite. It suggests these studies might be flawed, sometimes funded by pro-trans groups.
And the suicide stats.
It even raises questions about those, suggesting that when you analyze the data differently, some studies might actually show higher suicide attempt rates among those who've had medical interventions.
Okay, so there's a lot of debate around the medical and therapeutic side. What about the broader culture? How does the material see this playing out?
Well, it talks about how quickly transgenderism seems to have moved into the mainstream. It uses the phrase, the transgender takeover.
Strong phrase. What examples does it give?
Lots. Media portrayals are a big one, citing popular shows like Glee, Transparent, Orange is the New Black, high-profile figures like Caitlyn Jenner, even mentions appearances in shows for preschoolers.
Preschoolers, wow.
Yeah. And it goes beyond media, into sports, for instance. It references the historical Renee Richards tennis case, but also more recent examples like Selena Sol.
She's a track athlete.
Right, who spoke out about competing against and losing to biological males after policy changes in high school sports.
Okay, what else?
Drag queen story hour events are mentioned, and just the general normalization of asking for and using preferred pronouns is highlighted as part of this wider cultural shift.
And the material focuses quite a bit on schools, doesn't it? The education system.
A huge focus, framed as how sex ed led to gender ed. The report argues that sexuality education became a kind of vehicle for gender ideology.
How so? What tools or methods does it mention?
It talks about resources like the gender unicorn and the genderbread person being used in schools to teach kids about gender identity and expression as separate from biological sex. And then there's some pretty concerning claims presented about teachers allegedly recruiting students online, tracking their interests, using what the author calls mind tricks on young kids.
Mind tricks.
That's the term used. Introducing these concepts subtly, and even claims about actively hiding a student's adopted gender identity from their parents.
Hiding it from parents. Is that legal?
Well, the report mentions specific state laws, citing Washington and Maryland as examples, which reportedly can facilitate keeping parents out of the loop on this.
Wow. Okay, so you have this cultural shift, this push in education. How does the material describe the response to disagreement, the legal and social pressure?
It's described pretty dramatically. The phrase used is being crushed by the boot of the pink police state.
That's evocative. What's the argument?
The argument presented is that the concept of anti-discrimination is being used almost like a weapon, that disagreeing with gender ideology is being treated as equivalent to, say, racism.
Even though gender itself is framed as fluid and subjective in the theory.
Exactly. That's the contradiction pointed out. And it details some specific chilling examples.
Like what?
Like the case of Rob Hoogland in Canada, a father who was reportedly legally banned, like by court order, from calling his biological daughter by her birth name or using female pronouns.
After she transitioned socially at school.
Yes, following the parents' divorce. And the report says the judge actually deemed his refusal to use the male name and pronouns as family violence.
Family violence for using the birth name. Good grief.
Yeah. And the material also gives other examples of people facing consequences for dissenting. Abigail Schreier, the author.
Irreversible damage, right?
Right. Facing censorship, cancellation attempts for her book, or businesses like Jack Phillips, the baker, being sued repeatedly over refusing to create cakes with certain messages.
And it mentions the Equality Act in the U.S.
Yes. Raising concerns about potential implications, particularly for medical professionals or hospitals who might object to performing transition-related procedures based on conscience or medical judgment.
So did the author speak to proponents of these policies and ideas?
Yes, the report includes interactions with figures like Rodrigo Heng-Lettinen from the National Center for Transgender Equality, NCTE, and Congressman Mark Takano.
And what was their focus as presented?
Their focus is described as being primarily on ending discrimination and advocating for policies like expanding insurance coverage for medical transitions.
Okay, but could they define woman?
Well, that's highlighted as a key point. According to the material, when asked directly for a definition, they often struggled or deflected.
How so?
Sometimes resorting to accusing the questioner of having bad intentions or being transphobic, effectively trying to shut down the conversation. The framing seemed to be that even asking the question or disagreeing was tantamount to denying someone's existence.
So, okay, you have these complex, sometimes evasive responses contrasted with... Did anyone offer a simple definition?
Yes. The material makes a point of highlighting the voices of resistance, people who offered very clear, straightforward definitions rooted in biology.
Who, for instance?
People like Dr. Miriam Grossman, the child psychiatrist we mentioned earlier. Her definition is presented as a biological being with 2 X chromosomes who reproduces via egg. Simple biology.
Okay. Any others?
Yeah, there's a quote from a store owner, Don Sucher, who gives a very blunt biologically based answer involving anatomy, and Selena Soul, the athlete, just simply stating a woman is female.
So these individuals and others who resisted, they're sort of framed as heroes in the report.
Pretty much, yeah. People who stood up to the pressure. We already mentioned Selena Soul speaking out despite fearing backlash.
Right.
Then there's Scott Nugent, who shared her own incredibly difficult story after transitioning and then detransitioning.
Dealing with severe complications.
Yeah, infections, PTSD, really tough stuff. But sharing her story, she said, despite the suffering, finding unexpected support, and stressing the need to save kids.
And parents, too.
Parents are definitely highlighted. Rob Hoogland, facing the courts. An immigrant father named Ahmed reportedly threatened with CPS in a hospital if he didn't immediately affirm his son's new gender identity. And Charlie Jacobs, a mother whose daughter experienced what's called ROGD.
ROGD.
Rapid onset gender dysphoria, believed by the mother in this case to be heavily influenced by online communities and school environment.
It's a lot. And then the epilogue.
Yeah.
It takes a very different turn, right? Traveling to Africa.
Yeah, fascinating shift. The author visits the Maasai people in Africa, presented as a society largely untouched by Western gender theory.
And their understanding of male and female.
Described as very simple, very direct, based entirely on observable biological reality on what they have seen throughout their lives. Male roles, female roles, based on biology.
And concepts like non-binary.
They were reportedly just confused by the question. It didn't compute within their framework.
And the material draws a contrast in terms of happiness.
A powerful contrast, yeah. It portrays the Maasai as having a sense of happiness rooted in community, family, basic needs, love.
Compared to the West.
Compared to what the author describes as a weight of unhappiness and confusion observed in the West, particularly around these identity issues.
And this frames gender theory as,
in the report's view, a monumental social construct. Something born out of Western privilege, luxury, and decadence. Basically, problems you can only afford to have when basic needs are met and there's too much navel-gazing.
That's a strong claim. So think about that contrast for a second. It raises fundamental questions about identity itself, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The report really explores these different perspectives. Is identity something defined purely from within the self? Your internal feeling is paramount? Versus identity being rooted in something external, something objective, like nature, community, duties, and responsibilities.
And this ties directly into different ideas about happiness.
Right. Exactly. Does happiness come from getting the world to affirm your internal self-defined identity? Or does it come from becoming who we were created to be, aligning with biological and social realities?
So pulling back for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just underscore the core contrast the material keeps returning to.
Yeah, it's that stark difference between the complex, often shifting, sometimes contradictory arguments presented by proponents of gender theory.
And the simple, consistent, biologically grounded definitions offered by those who resist it.
Right.
And the conclusion drawn in this investigation, it's pretty clear this isn't just presented as some academic debate.
No, it's framed as a fundamental struggle. A struggle over truth, over the nature of reality itself, and maybe most critically, over the protection of vulnerable people, especially children.
But the report doesn't end on a completely pessimistic note.
No, it expresses a strong belief, actually, that despite powerful forces, political, cultural, medical, pushing this agenda, there's a significant and growing resistance. A pushback rooted in, well, common sense and observable biological facts.
And it suggests practical ways people can resist.
Yeah, like resisting the pressure to adopt the ideological language, avoiding phrases like menstruating people, if you mean women, or not changing pronouns if it goes against your conviction about reality. Small acts of semantic resistance, maybe.
Makes sense.
And finally, the material really emphasizes the responsibility it sees parents having, a need to be aware of all the influences shaping their kids' school, internet, social media, the whole landscape.
And it suggests family stability as a factor.
Yes, posits that a stable family environment might play a role in a child's resilience or vulnerability to these kinds of external ideological pressures.
So wrapping this up, we've journeyed through material that started with a question so basic it almost feels absurd.
What is a woman? Yeah.
Only to uncover these really unexpected historical roots, explore the huge societal impact today, and lay out these incredibly stark, contrasting views on identity, on reality, and even on what it means to be happy.
It really does boil down to that central tension presented throughout the work, doesn't it? Is our identity, our well-being, found primarily inside ourselves in self-definition, needing external affirmation for that feeling?
Oh.
Or is it found by aligning ourselves with observable reality, with our biology, and fulfilling those fundamental human connections and responsibilities within a community, within a shared reality?
So here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Think about that contrast presented in the material. The idea of happiness coming from defining yourself versus finding it in community and reality. What does that perspective raise for you about identity and well-being in the world today?